For today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Black Panther, the first ever black superhero movie to be made within the confines of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because the idea of having comic book movies based on black superheroes isn't anything new, it's just one of those things where the past few comic book movies to be based on black superheroes have ranged from either being okay to being god-awful. So, in a sense, we are yet in another Wonder Woman type of situation, but that's a whole nother story entirely. And much like Wonder Woman, Black Panther is also one of those characters that's been tossed around Hollywood for quite some time, actually. The earliest mention of a Black Panther movie was during the early 90s when actor Wesley Snipes was in negotiations to play the titular character of Black Panther, and this was back in 1992. And keep in mind, this was way before Wesley Snipes played the main character in the Blade movies. However, as production progressed on the movie, a combination of Wesley Snipes along with Stan Lee were not pleased with the way the scripts were turning out for the project. Even Snipes said that there was some confusion among those who were unfamiliar with the comics, thinking that the film was going to be about the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party being this self-defense force that was formed in 1966 that was created for the sole purpose to patrol African-American neighborhoods to protect residents from acts of police brutality. But as production for the movie continued, the movie eventually ended up in development hell for several years. However, sometime around 2005, Marvel Entertainment began planning to create their own set of superhero movies and distribute them through Paramount Pictures. And as time went on, Kevin Feige, who was second in command at Marvel Entertainment at the time, came up with the idea for what would eventually become the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And as production for the Marvel Cinematic Universe progressed, the original lineup for what characters the studio wanted to adapt into movies was a really fascinating lineup because on one hand, characters like Captain America, Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, and Black Panther were meant to have their own movies, but several obscure characters were meant to have their own movies as well, from the likes of Hawkeye, Cloak and Dagger, the Power Pack, along with Shang-Chi. However, as time went on, Marvel gained the film rights to Iron Man from New Line Cinema because they had the rights to Iron Man for some goddamn reason, and eventually we ended up with the Phase 1 we know and love today. But even during the midst of the Phase 1 lineup of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Marvel stated again that they wanted to bring lesser-known properties onto the big screen from the likes of Black Panther, Cable, Iron Fist, Nighthawk, along with the Vision. Just let that sink in for a second. There are two different points in time where Black Panther was considered to be a part of the Phase 1 lineup. Since then, the character has gone to appear in the ensemble movie Captain America Civil War, where he, along with Spider-Man, were considered to be major highlights of that movie. And here we are talking about the long-awaited Black Panther movie. Which brings me to my question. Is the Black Panther the first good black superhero movie? As for the plot of the movie, set sometime after the events of Captain America Civil War, T'Challa returns to his homeland of Wakanda and takes his rightful place as king. While adjusting to life as the new king of Wakanda, an exiled Wakandan known as Killmonger resurfaces to challenge T'Challa for the throne of Wakanda. T'Challa's mantle as both king and current incarnation of Black Panther is tested when he is drawn into a conflict that puts the entire fate of Wakanda in the Western world at risk. Can T'Challa balance life as both king and current Black Panther, or will Killmonger and his allies take over Wakanda for their own needs? And before I even begin my critique of the movie, I will say this much. Black Panther is easily the best superhero movie to be based on a black superhero, which isn't really saying much since you had a lot of other black superhero movies that were really never that good to begin with, so Black Panther gets that title by default in this case. But anywho, in terms of what I liked about the movie, I find the movie refreshing in a sense of its tone, because ever since the first Iron Man movie came out, all the other installments within the MCU essentially show that Iron Man formula of being these light-hearted action-adventure films, with the exceptions of the Captain America movies that were directed by the Russo brothers. But even then, those two Captain America movies still had their own own sense of humor. That was very much within the same vein as the other installments of the MCU. With this movie, on the other hand, this is perhaps the most serious of the MCU. Like, I don't think a movie within the MCU has been this serious since the 2008 Incredible Hulk movie, because that movie was never played up for laughs at all. I mean, yeah, sure, it had two comical moments, but again, that movie was serious from start to finish. So it's nice to see a movie within the MCU to have that same kind of serious tone. I also thought that the movie had really good pacing and really took its time with the story. Although I do think that the movie does slow down a tad bit once the main villain takes over Wakanda, but other than that, I think the movie does have some really good pacing. I also like the fact that this movie continues the origin for the T'Challa character, because in Captain America Civil War, that movie in and of itself was essentially an origin story for the Black Panther, but here's the thing, that movie only revealed half the origin. So I like the fact that they continue his origin in this movie. And by doing so, we learn a lot more about the Wakandan culture, which I thought was really cool. And speaking of Wakanda, I also love the overall visual aesthetics of Wakanda, because back when Avengers Age of Ultron came out, a lot of people speculated that the city in which both Iron Man and Hulk fought in was Wakanda. And when I first heard about this information, I had my doubts about it, because the city in which both Avengers fight in doesn't look nearly as advanced as it should be. But when we do see Wakanda in this, it is the Wakanda like you do see in the comics, where it's got that combination of both looking utopian, but also looks very tribal at the same time, and looks like a real place. Like, I wanted to explore this nation of Wakanda. Like, it looks that real. In a sense of how the city was set up, in terms of the overall layout, along with what type of technology they had. In short, Wakanda in this movie looks awesome. I also think that the movie has some really good production values, and the fact that they're used really well here. Granted, a movie that's made within the confines of the MCU is guaranteed to have some really good production values to begin with, so in some sense, the combination of the CGI along with the costuming is very standard, but good nonetheless. I also like the soundtrack that the movie has, where it's one part tribal music playing throughout a good majority of the movie, but mixes it with classical music. Although throughout the movie they do play some hip-hop and rap, which does stick out like a sore thumb, but it's played so little that it doesn't completely distract me. And I know that the idea of mixing tribal music with some classical music sounds really odd, but the movie finds a way to blend the two together to work to the film's advantage. I also think that everybody within the movie gives really good performances, from Chad Boseman playing the title character of T'Challa to Michael B. Jordan playing a really good villain. Although the only performances I had problems with were with Martin Freeman and Andy Serkis, but I'll talk about them later. And speaking of characters, let's talk about the main character of the movie, shall we? Because T'Challa within this movie is a very refreshing kind of protagonist to see on screen, for a couple reasons. One, from the get-go, he's already matured. And second, we have a movie that's about a king trying to operate his own nation. I don't think that's ever been done before in a Marvel movie. And why I bring this up, when you look back to some of the other Marvel films, most of the protagonists ranging from the likes of Iron Man to Doctor Strange are these guys who are really smart, but they're also really arrogant and don't really mature until the end of their first solo outing. Then you got a character like Thor, who technically is a prince of Asgard who is in line to be king at one point, but Thor himself doesn't become king of Asgard until the very end of Thor Ragnarok. With T'Challa, on the other hand, at the very start of this movie, he's already king and does act maturely here. And for good reason. Because back when the character first appeared in Captain America Civil War, he was only prince, and sometime after his father died, that's when he took part in the conflict and was acting immature, since his way of thinking was clouded by vengeance, until the realization that Bucky wasn't the one that killed his father, but Zemo was the one that killed his father, and then saw himself in Zemo and realized, this is not the man I want to become. By the time this movie came around, he's already king from the get-go, and he realizes that in order to run a nation, he needs to have a clear head. It needs to be a bit more sophisticated to become king of Wakanda. Michael B. Jordan's performance as Killmonger's movie is perhaps his best role in a superhero movie yet, because back when he played Cyborg in Justice League Flashpoint Paradox, he played the role of Cyborg fine, but wasn't really anything special. And when he played Johnny Storm in the Fan Stick movie, you can tell that he was trying to give a good performance, but the material in which he was given wasn't letting him reach his full potential. Again, Fantastic was just a bad movie in general. But I'll say this much. I think out of the superhero movies that Michael B. Jordan played in so far, this will be the one that he will be remembered for the most. And as far as his character of Killmonger goes, he's definitely one of the better villains of the MCU. I don't think he's as good as someone like the Vulture, but I'll address the problems I have with the character later. And as far as the support cast goes, like I said earlier, everyone plays their part well. Although if I had to pick one character that really stood out to me would be T'Challa's younger sister, Shuri, because Shuri within the context of the movie is actually a very memorable character for a couple reasons. The first one being that she is the younger sister to T'Challa, making her the first princess within the MCU that we actually ever get to meet on the big screen. Second, she's not your typical princess character, because on top of being the princess of Wakanda, she's also a very intelligent inventor. Like, if I had to describe the relationship between Shuri and T'Challa, it's kind of like the relationship that Q has with James Bond. And third, she's comical relief done right. Because we have a lot of the MCU movies that have a lot of comical relief characters, but in my opinion, the movie really doesn't need those characters. Because the movie itself can be comical to begin with in some cases, and the comical relief characters don't really contribute much to the movie. Shuri, on the other hand, does a lot throughout the entire movie, and her humor is welcomed within the movie, since the movie isn't really comical to begin with. So her sense of humor actually adds a lot of levity to the movie. I also like the fact that this movie does the same thing with its villains that Spider-Man Homecoming did with its villains, where it features multiple villains, but they're shown in a way that actually feels right. Because Black Panther does something I don't think any other superhero movie has done in a while. It takes three of Black Panther's biggest adversaries and manages to incorporate them all into one movie, but finds a way to balance out each character. Since you do have the likes of Killmonger being the main villain, while Ulysses Claw's the secondary villain, and as for the third villain, M'Baku, who you may know as Man-Ape from the comics, even though M'Baku is typically depicted as a supervillain within the Black Panther comics, within the movie, he's actually not villainous, but he is depicted as a ruthless warrior who's the leader of Wakanda's mountain tribe, the Jabari, and does serve as a arch-rival to T'Challa, since the two characters are at odds with one another. So I like the way that relationship is handled. Although in some ways I do think that M'Baku should have been the main villain in some cases, since I think the visual style of Black Panther battling someone like M'Baku would have been much more visually refreshing, since we could have had a fight scene that's more reminiscent of a Daredevil battling Kingpin scenario, where we have one character that's smaller and more agile, while you have one character that's larger and stronger. And the character himself does have some comical moments too, although he himself is not really comical to begin with. But anywho, we have another superhero movie where it features multiple villains, but it balances out each villain in a way where the movie doesn't feel overcrowded, even if one of the villainous characters doesn't really play the role of a villain within the confines of the story. And before I go into what I disliked about the movie, the one last positive aspect of the movie that I want to address is the fact that this movie is one of 3 Marvel movies to have a message behind it. That message being African nationalism. And why I want to bring it up, it's one of those messages that I've seen before in the movie, but just because I've seen it before doesn't mean that it's not relevant. If anything, that message is still relevant in today's culture. And I think that the message is well executed for the most part. There are definitely some points in time where the movie can get a tad bit preachy with its message, but other than that, I think that the movie's message is handled pretty well. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, some of the visual aesthetics in this movie are still pretty good, but there are several points in time where the green screen and or CGI looked like it needed to be polished a lot more. The two examples that I can think of off the top of my head are several points in time where you see some of the main characters interacting with some rhinos that are entirely CGI, and the CGI used on them does not look convincing at all. Like, I wish that maybe the production crew should have made some animatronic rhinos to interact with the characters in the movie, because at least it would have given the actors to interact with some kind of object and make the scenes work a lot better than have the actors interact with nothing, then insert with poorly made CGI rhinos. Granted, the rhinos don't really appear in the movie all that much, but you get my point in terms of they could have used practical effects in some cases. For my second example is the final battle between Black Panther and Killmonger, because the combination of green screen and CGI used for their final fight looks terrible. Because as I sat there watching the movie, I was like, this isn't a fight scene from a movie. This is a fight scene from a video game. It just did not look all that convincing to me, because there are several other points in time where they use a lot of green screen for certain fight scenes, and it looked 20 times better than what was shown here. Like, I couldn't really connect with this fight scene at all because of how unpolished the CGI and green screen were for this one fight scene. And speaking of fight scenes, there are certain fight scenes in the movie that I had a hard time following for different reasons. Case in point, when you see Black Panther's first fight scene in this movie, the lighting for that particular sequence is really dark to a point where I had a hard time making out what was going on. Granted, I get that the scene takes place at night and everything's meant to be dark, but when you watch the movie and all you see is the light of the AK-47s going off and that's the only light you see other than the moon, that's not a good sign. Then you have a few other fight scenes where the camera placement and movement was all over the place. For example, there's this one point in time where some of the characters go to South Korea to get one of the bad guys, and a fight ensues. Now, conceptually, I like the idea of the camera movement during this one particular fight scene, since it's got that Birdman cinematography where there's no cuts, it's all done a continuous shot. But when it does so, it's got that shaky cam thing going on, which makes it really hard to focus on who's beating up who in some cases. And continuing off the final battle between Black Panther and Killmonger, other than the visual aesthetics of that scene, I wasn't really too impressed by that fight scene altogether neither. I felt very underwhelmed by it. And by the time it came to an end, I was like, well, that was anticlimactic. Like, I didn't really feel any suspense coming out of that scene altogether. Another problem that I have with the movie is the overall sense of humor that accompanies the film. Because when I was talking about Shuri earlier in the movie, she's essentially the main form of comical relief that actually contributes to the movie. And anytime she does provide some comical moments, it feels welcomed. Yet, when the movie attempts to insert some humor, it feels really forced. Like, I'm convinced that someone at Marvel watching early cut the movie and thought it was too dark and told the director to add some more jokes within the same vein as the rest of the MCU. And it just doesn't work out, in my opinion. And as far as the performances go, I think that all the actors play their roles really well, with the exception of 2 of the 3 characters, one of them being Martin Freeman's performance as Everett Ross. Because when Martin Freeman played Everett Ross back in Captain America Civil War, Everett Ross in that movie was essentially a more sarcastic version of Agent Phil Coulson from the Phase 1 Marvel movies. And when we first see Everett Ross in this movie, Martin Freeman plays Everett Ross like he did in Captain America Civil War, but once Everett Ross ends up in Wakanda, it feels like Martin Freeman's performance as Everett Ross in the second half of the movie is so drastically different from how he acted in the first half. If I had to describe his performance in the second half of the movie, it almost feels like Martin Freeman was reprising his role as Bilbo Baggins from the Hobbit trilogy, because a lot of the mannerisms that Martin Freeman displays during the second half of the movie felt more in line with the mannerisms that Bilbo Baggins had in the Hobbit trilogy than it did with Everett Ross in the first half of the movie. At least that's how I feel about it. Then you have Andy Serkis's depiction of Odysseus Claw in this movie, and it's so drastically different from his depiction of the character back when we first met him in Avengers Age of Ultron. Because if I describe his depiction of the character in that movie, he essentially played a no-nonsense arms dealer. Granted, he did have a funny line here and there revolved around Cuttlefish when he was talking to Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, but he mainly did this to taunt the twins, showing that he didn't take either of them seriously. Andy Serkis' depiction of the character in this movie, however, it's a complete 180. He's just a cartoon character, albeit an entertaining cartoon character, but the more I saw Ulysses Claw in this movie, he went from being entertainingly funny to becoming really obnoxious to a point that he started to annoy the hell out of me. And speaking of villains, I have several problems revolved around the Killmonger character, and I'm only going to talk about the Killmonger for quite a bit since I've already said my piece on the other two villains of Ulysses Claw and M'Baku. But on to Killmonger, because way before the movie even came out, the Killmonger character has gained a lot of hype to the point where many people declare that Killmonger is the greatest villain of the MCU, to the point where many people say that he's the villain to solve the villain problem that Marvel's been having the past several installments. And I completely disagree with that, because on one hand, yes, Killmonger is definitely one of the better villains of the MCU, but he's not the best. Like, in my opinion, a villain who solved the villain problem to the point where, in my opinion, they're the greatest villain of the MCU is the Vulture, because that villain is relatable, design-wise looks incredible, and is a complete and utter opposite to the main hero, and actually has an interesting interaction with said hero. With Killmonger, on the other hand, he feels like a retread of several other villains I've seen before, because on one hand, Killmonger has some kind of connection with the main hero. There's a plot twist revolved around him at one point, a plot twist that's rather underwhelming and predictable, and the character at the end of the day is just an evil doppelganger of the main hero. And I am so sick and tired of seeing the main villain of the movie be an evil doppelganger, because during the Phase 1 movies that Marvel released way back when, all the main villains in some shape or form were essentially evil versions of the main character. For example, Iron Man battling Ironmonger is just a battle between two guys in high-tech armors. The battle between the Hulk and Abomination is essentially a battle between two uber-humans. The battle between Captain America and Red Skull is a battle between two super soldiers. The battle between Thor and Loki is a battle between two Norse gods. But keep in mind, most of those heroes battling evil versions of themselves primarily came out of the Phase 1 of the MCU, where Marvel Studios was going through an experimental phase of making these movies, which I find to be acceptable. But anytime Marvel introduced a new character since then, that's just literally been it. It's just the hero battling an evil version of themselves. Case in point, Ant-Man battling Yellow Jacket is just a battle between two guys that have suits that allow them to grow and shrink, and Doctor Strange battling Caecilius, two guys that use magic against one another. Like, you get my point here, right? Granted, I feel like the only two movies that did not introduce an evil doppelganger of the hero were the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie along with Spider-Man Homecoming. But back to the main villain of this movie, Killmonger at the end of the day is just an evil Wakandan. That's it. And as far as his costume goes, he actually goes through several throughout the whole movie, and I actually am okay with the costume that he wears for the first half of the movie, where he has like that mercenary outfit on in reference to his mercenary outfit in the comics. And there is a point in time where he does wear a mask in reference to his more armored look in the comics, and I was actually kind of hoping that maybe in the second half of the film he will have made like an armor that's very reminiscent of his yellow and red costume from the comics. However, by the time we get to the final battle, he is basically just seen wearing a variation of the Black Panther suit that most people dubbed the Golden Jaguar. And this is as copy and paste as you can get with a villain. Granted, I know that Killmonger in the comics does become the Black Panther at one point in time, but I feel like you didn't need to have Killmonger wear the Golden Jaguar armor. You could just had him wear a costume that's very much reminiscent of his red and yellow costume from the comics. Even Yellow Jacket wasn't as copy and paste as Killmonger was in this last half of the movie. And one last thing about the Killmonger character. His screen time is very oddly placed, because when you first meet the character, it's within the first 10 to 15 minutes of the movie. But as the movie progresses, he disappears disappears for a good chunk of the movie to a point where he reappears an hour later, and when he does reappear, I completely forgot he was in the movie entirely. It almost feels like when it came to Marvel deciding who the main villain of this movie should be, it feels like you had one group of people that wanted Ulysses Claw to be the main villain, while the other half wanted Killmonger to be the main villain. And I think maybe there was two scripts at one point, and they decided to merge the scripts together at one point, and they went through and rewrote a few scenes where Ulysses Claw primarily appears in the first half, while Killmonger appears primarily in the second half of the movie. At least that's what felt like to me. So, for my final verdict of Black Panther, the movie is both familiar and different at the same time. In that sense of, if you've seen all the other movies within the MCU, it definitely has the same kind of visual aesthetics and formula that you've seen in a movie within the MCU, but tonally speaking, it's perhaps the most different. Because unlike the other movies, which were usually lighthearted action-adventure movies, this one's more like a dark political thriller in the same vein as Captain America Winter Soldier, but in some cases, this movie is perhaps even darker than that installment. Maybe not as dark as something like The Dark Knight or Logan, but perhaps this is the most mature movie seen within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, overall, Black Panther is totally the most different of the MCU movies, but still a good installment nonetheless. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Black Panther? So, the movie got really good reception. I'll admit, the movie is good, I just don't think it's that good. And so, for my final rating of Black Panther, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. So, who's your favorite black superhero? And see you later.